So, welcome back, everybody. It's part two of our discussion about pain flares. Now, again, like I said, this is part two of our three-part discussion on how to end pain flares. And if you haven't already had the chance to listen to part one, definitely go check that out. I'm so glad you're here. I'm a chronic pain specialist. I'm the founder of the Chronic Pain Breakup Method. And what we're talking about today is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about because I think we can all agree that quick fixes don't really work all that well. They don't have a lasting impact, and for the most part, I'm of the belief that you don't need more creative, inventive ways to manage your pain or cope better with your pain. Right? So I've dedicated my career to helping those who are looking for a better way than that sort of outdated medical model, because I know how much this impacts every part of your life, your relationships, your freedom, your independence. Okay. So yesterday in part one, I talked a little bit about why these pain flares happen in the first place. I told you that this kind of pain, longstanding stubborn pain, involves sensitivity of the pain system itself, which is why it's so important to stop that push and crush cycle that just reinforces those overactive pain pathways. And I walked you through what you can do when that crash happens so that you can calm the storm faster, put out the fire faster, and minimize the intensity, right? You learned how to manage pain flares, right? But managing pain flares isn't enough, okay? My client Heidi was literally living one day at a time, constantly dreading the next pain flare. Her pain felt totally random, like almost like it had a mind of its own. And it would flare up without any reason. She felt like she was walking on eggshells all the time. She was always sort of bracing for impact. And so, um, of course, she tried everything that they say you should do. She tracked her symptoms. She had a binder filled with notes on her symptoms, on what foods she ate, tracking every little move that she ever did, and even tracked the weather. But even though she was doing all that, she still couldn't really find any consistent patterns or triggers. Okay. She was living in that constant fear, right? She felt like she had no control. It felt like she was just a victim in her own body. And so you can imagine, right? When I told her that one of our goals was for her to be able to predict and prevent her pain flares, she thought I was crazy. Okay. But like I said yesterday, and I'm telling you now, pain is not random. Okay. It is a response to something. We may just need to dig deeper to figure out what your body is responding to. And so that is what we're talking about today. Okay. This is building block number two to ending pain flares, is to learn how to prevent pain flares, right? It's not enough just to manage the pain when it gets bad. You also need to know how to prevent it from getting bad in the first place, right? And no one teaches this stuff, right? What doctor has ever explained this to you before? They haven't, right? Because the medical system isn't set up to teach you this, right? Your doctors focus on reactive care. They respond after the problem happens, after the symptoms happen. And many of us were conditioned to rely on the healthcare system for answers. But when it comes to chronic pain, all of a sudden you have to become your own advocate, right? For years, Shannon trusted the more than a handful of doctors and specialists and surgeons with her care. But after 15 years and 7 surgeries and pills and injections, and eventually being recommended a spinal cord stimulator, she'd seen enough, right? To finally get to that point and realize that even the more conservative and holistic doctors weren't ever going to give her the tools to help her with her pain, right? The story was, well, you have this diagnosis now, so there's nothing else that we can do. And she realized that she would have to stop relying on that medical system and step outside of the medical system because they were never going to give her what she was looking for and what she really needed. And no one ever told her that she could prevent her pain flares. No one ever told her that she could actually take control of her pain. So it totally makes sense to me if you feel like at this point you feel stuck or overwhelmed, you feel like you keep, turning to your doctors for help and keep hitting dead ends. And you keep hoping that they'll find something wrong, that they'll give you a diagnosis that finally makes sense, and that they'll finally have some treatments that'll actually fix it. It totally breaks my heart because so many women have told me that they would rather have breast cancer than chronic pain. And if you've had that thought too, like it totally makes sense to me because you've been struggling for so long, struggling to find an accurate diagnosis, struggling to find treatments that work, struggling for validation and acknowledgement from doctors, struggling to deal with the shame and the stigma of having an invisible pain that no one understands. It totally makes sense to me because if it is cancer, at least you would have a clear diagnosis, right? At least you'd know precisely what's wrong. You'd know kind of what you're dealing with. You wouldn't have to prove that your pain is real. And not always, but sometimes if it's cancer, there's treatments available. And so it makes sense to me if you feel stuck, overwhelmed, frustrated, like there's no hope, because no one has ever told you what you can do and how you can address this specific type of pain that is different because it involves overactive pain pathways, right? Shannon was using her TENS unit and creams and pills, and it makes that sense that she didn't know that other protectors could exist beyond that because that was all that she was told that she could do for her pain, right? The reality is the medical professionals, they are doing the best they can with the tools they have, and there's a gap in the system. It's not that they're withholding information, it's the way the traditional system approaches pain doesn't take into account what's actually contributing to chronic pain, right? They're really good at acute pain, they're not good at chronic pain. And the idea that you can stop your pain flares or prevent your pain flares might be a foreign concept to you. And it makes sense to me because you've never been taught this before. But what usually happens during those times where pain isn't as bad, right? The pain is lower on your good days. Most people push themselves to get as much done as possible. They live in that classic push and crash cycle. They push themselves and eventually it's too much and they crash and the pain flares and they pay for it in pain. So it's like they're living from one flare up to the next. They feel like they have no control and it's terrifying, right? When those stretches of good days become shorter and shorter and shorter, and it feels like your life is kind of slipping away. And the problem is this cycle, it's it's creating these pain patterns and it strengthens and reinforces pain pathways, giving it a stronghold. The other thing that happens is most people start avoiding things that could cause pain or have caused pain in the past, right? You identify your triggers or you try to identify your triggers, right? And then you just avoid them. So, and some people become overly cautious and avoid things, the activities, the exercises, the positions and movements. And while avoiding them may seem safer, the issue is this, it actually can widen that disconnect between the brain and body, which actually makes the pain system more sensitive. It actually makes pain worse. It tells your pain system to keep those defenses high. Interesting. So preventing pain flares doesn't mean we just want to avoid everything that might cause pain, avoid your triggers. No. Okay. In fact, you were probably taught that you should track your symptoms and look for triggers. Maybe your doctors and therapists have even asked you what triggers your pain, right? So how many of you have tried tracking your triggers? Let me know. Type yes in the chat if you are with me, you're listening live. Have you been able to figure out your triggers? How many of you are a little overwhelmed or flustered by this question? Let me know. Say yes or no. Yes in the chat. If you've tried tracking your symptoms and you're a little overwhelmed by it, because your pain is not that simple. It's hard to know your triggers because your pain is so inconsistent, right? Some days you can climb 2 flights of stairs and be fine, and other days you climb 2 steps and you're in pain for 3 days. And it's like, what the hell? You've been taught to look for triggers, but the thing is, the word triggers implies that there is this simple cause and effect relationship, right? If I do X, then I get pain. But when your pain system is hypersensitive, when you have overactive pain pathways, this kind of pain isn't linear like that. Okay, this kind of pain isn't formulaic or cookie cutter. This pain is multifactorial. The pain system, your pain system, is reacting to multiple variables at once. This is why focusing on your triggers isn't really that helpful. Okay, this is why so many people get stuck, because we are focusing on triggers. So instead, I want you to think about amplifiers. Okay, amplifiers are things that increase the sensitivity of your pain system. Okay, think of your pain system like a scale, right? There you go. I had to change the slide. Think of your pain system like this scale, and each amplifier is like adding a small pebble to one side of that scale. And as these amplifiers add up, the scale starts tipping towards a pain flare. Okay, one pebble might not tip the scale by itself, but as more amplifiers get added, right, stress, poor sleep, weather changes, for example, they start piling up and it's teetering on the edge, right? And then all it takes is one seemingly harmless move, right? You roll over in bed and it sends you into a flare. And normally, you might think of rolling over in bed as a trigger and start saying things like, rolling in bed isn't safe. I should avoid that, and I should try to sleep like a log, stiff as a board. Okay, this way of thinking makes it seem like rolling in bed is this huge rock of an amplifier, when really it's this little pebble. It was just a thing that tipped the scale, right? Now, what makes this tricky is that these pebbles, these amplifiers, they aren't always the obvious things, okay? For example, my client Renee, she thought her only triggers were squatting and bending, but everything else beyond that, totally random. Like some days walking would set it off, other days she could walk her dogs and have no issues. So she was avoiding, right? She had no idea what could set it off. And so she became fearful of basically everything. If you don't know, everything is kind of terrifying. And she didn't know about amplifiers, but we worked on that together. We worked together to dig deeper and to identify some of her amplifiers. And we started with the more obvious things at first: squatting and bending and twisting, vacuuming, unloading the dishwasher, right? But then we started adding some others, things that she never realized could be contributing. Things like skipping meals and staying up late, going to doctor's appointments. Seriously, going to doctor's appointments is an amplifier. And getting unwanted advice, right? Particularly from her spouse. But yeah, Renee had to dig deeper to identify some of her amplifiers that were not so obvious amplifiers, right? So why is this important? Well, amplifiers play a big role in your pain prevention plan. Okay, there are 2 parts to this pain prevention plan. The first part is to predict. You need to be able to anticipate pain flares, right? You do this by identifying your amplifiers. Okay. Now, again, like I said, amplifiers, they're different for everyone. Not everyone has the same amplifiers. And this is something that, like I said, it takes time to realize. You can start by sitting down and actually brainstorming these. Write down as many of these things that you can think of, starting with the more obvious ones, and then getting into the more subtle ones or the more hidden ones. Okay. And if all you have on your list are physical movements and activities, things like putting away the laundry, sitting for too long, carrying heavy objects, grocery bags, whatever, you're not going deep enough. Okay. I'll just say some of the biggest ones for folks that I've seen are traveling, right? Time changes, things like daylight savings time, or if you're changing time zones, right? Seasonal changes are big. And I mean both seasonal changes, like as in season, as in weather, changes in weather, but also going through seasons of life, like a seasons of life change, like when your kids are suddenly home from school after summer for summer break, or your spring break, right? Um, Other big ones, anytime your normal routines are thrown off, those are big times for amplifiers. Normal routines get thrown off. Holidays are big flare up times, amplifier, holidays, okay? Big changes in weather, sudden changes in weather, those are amplifiers, and big life changes, okay? Divorce, loss of a loved one, losing your job, moving. Those are all really big amplifiers for a lot of folks that are not necessarily physical, right? But they're big amplifiers, okay? So then you want to go even deeper and think about the little pebbles, right? Going back to that slide, you want to think about the little pebbles, the things that may even seem like they're almost like grains of sand, like eating too much processed food or artificial sweeteners. Socializing could be an amplifier. Talking about your pain with people who don't understand, right? Too much screen time, holding on to resentment for your spouse, that could be an amplifier. Some of the negative self-talk, the shame and the blame, those are big ones for the women I work with. Taking on too much and people pleasing, right? Those are amplifiers, and you need to go deep to identify these kinds of amplifiers. And if you're here with me live right now, go ahead and I want you to type one or two of your amplifiers into the chat. So as we're talking about it, I want you to take just a second, take a moment to think about it. Don't be shy. Go ahead and type one or two of your amplifiers that you can think of and put them in the chat. Because again, it's important that we share these because brainstorming helps. Getting them out there carries the stress. It's helpful to see what other people have amplifiers because it can kind of help you brainstorm what yours are, right? Again, these are things that increase sensitivity of your pain system. Yeah, they're pebbles that are not necessarily going to trigger pain by themselves, but they can amplify the sensitivity of the pain system. Okay, so there are your obvious amplifiers, things like heavy lifting, washing windows, maybe getting out in or out of the car, or they could be environmental or emotional or mental, right? They can be stressors, things that people say, things that you say to yourself. These can be behaviors, habits, people, places, expectations, experiences, thoughts, and beliefs, right? So type them in the chat. I'm seeing stress, travel, time change, dog is dying, holiday, people pleasing, stress, my husband, God bless him, thinking or talking about my pain, thinking about not being able to do what I used to do, job, life changes, daughter moving out on her own. Yes, these are some really good examples. You guys did a really good job. So this is what some of those pebbles are that could be adding up and tipping the scales. Stress, caring for my mom, hearing about others' pain, cold weather. Yes. Okay. So that is the first part of your pain prevention plan is anticipating the flares, know your amplifiers, being able to predict. Okay. And the second part, going to the right slide, the second part is prevention, right? You need to then proactively prevent the flare ups. And so we're not just going to push through or overdo it on those good days, right? Instead, once you know your amplifiers and like really know your amplifiers, you can counterbalance them with your protectors. Okay. Remember those protectors that we talked about yesterday in part one, right? Protectors are like pebbles on the other side of the scale. They keep it from tipping into that flare up zone. So, how does that actually work? Well, for example, um, I'm totally on the wrong slide, but that's okay. For example, my client Tammy would monitor her amplifiers day by day. So if she noticed some of them piling up, she'd intentionally add more of her protectors before the pain actually flared up. Things like gentle movements, sensory retraining, or some relaxation exercises, just for example. So then another client, just another example, she knew that traveling in the car was a big amplifier for her. So it wasn't a small pebble, it was like a rock. And when she knew that she had a long road trip coming up, she'd initially started to worry because anything like that would always cause a flare up for her and ruin the trip. So we worked together to identify which protectors she could use before the trip, right? The day before, right? Before she ever got in the car. What could she do? Which amplifiers could she use during the time in the car on the road trip? And then which ones could she use after the trip? Okay. And by planning ahead in this way, she was actually able to get through that road trip without sending her body into a huge flare. So this is how this works, right? You may not be always be able to prevent every flare up entirely, but at the very least, you can lessen the blow, right? And maybe your pain is totally unpredictable, totally inconsistent, right? When pain feels random, it's easy to feel like you can't prevent it. And also, when some pain flares may feel like they're totally random because you won't always be able to pinpoint all of the amplifiers every single time, most of my clients find that they can identify some factors, some of the factors leading up to it that are adding up that are not always the things that they would have expected. Okay. And this isn't about perfection either, because you won't catch every single amplifier every single time. And that's okay. That's okay. Right. But when you start paying attention, you'll be able to notice opportunities to step in before the pain tips into a full on flare. Now, for some of you, it might feel like you're in one massive flare or you're in pain all the time. And it's like, how can I prevent pain if I'm in pain all the time? Doesn't make sense. And so, yes, it makes sense to me if it's hard to kind of imagine how things could get better or how this could work if you're in pain all the time. And listen, you do not have to be totally pain-free to start. Okay, that's that all or nothing way of thinking that's getting in your way. Everyone has to start somewhere. So you start where you're at, right? Yes, I know that it may feel a little overwhelming, like everything is an amplifier. I hear you. That is really hard and really scary. And while it may seem overwhelming at first, you start small. And even though it may seem like your protectors in your toolkit are like these tiny little grains of sand compared to the giant boulders your amplifiers are, right? The thing is, you're chipping away at them. Even if you don't notice an immediate difference, over time, your pain system will become less sensitive and you don't have to do it all right now, one step at a time. Okay. And listen, maybe you're skeptical, right, that this could ever work. Maybe you've tried things like distraction techniques in the past. Maybe you've tried tracking your symptoms and writing everything down, and it was overwhelming and it made you feel like you were getting hyper focused on every little detail and it didn't actually give you any clear answers. And so it totally makes sense to me that you'd be skeptical that you could ever prevent your pain from flaring up. And you know what? Even if best case scenario, even if you were actually able to prevent most of your flares with this approach, it probably wouldn't solve all your problems. And it's like, what the, wait, what? That's the thing. There is no singular strategy or remedy or treatment by itself that will solve all of your problems, right? Remember, pain is multifactorial. So we need to layer different strategies together. This is just one piece of the puzzle that can have a huge impact, but there's other strategies that you can layer together to have an even bigger impact on your pain and your quality of life. And so that is what we're going to talk about in our next session tomorrow. So you're going to want to come back for that. Okay. The issue is, I know that some of you may not really get flare ups. And you may be thinking, oh, I'm not really sure if this applies to me. I don't really get flare ups. But remember, we talked about the big F flares, capital F flares, and the little f flares. And so maybe you don't get those big F flare ups. But if you're still struggling with those day-to-day spikes in pain, then yeah, this approach can help calm your pain system down overall. Even if your pain doesn't flare, quote unquote, flare in the traditional sense, the way that we normally think about a pain flare, you can still benefit from understanding your amplifiers and using your protectors. Why? Because it's about tipping the scale back in your favor. When you reduce amplifiers and add protectors, you're working to quiet these overactive pain pathways over time. Make sense? So to review, the key to preventing pain flares isn't to avoid your triggers. In fact, we're not even going to use the term triggers anymore because the word trigger implies that cause and effect relationship, a linear relationship. But complex and persistent pain isn't that simple. It's multifactorial. And instead, right, we talked about the importance of understanding your amplifiers, right, which are things that increase the sensitivity of your pain system. And we talked about how amplifiers can add up and tip the scales toward a flare. And we talked about how by understanding and anticipating your amplifiers, you can proactively use your protectors to prevent flare-ups, or at the very least, stop them in their tracks, right? And so for your homework, I challenge you to think of 6 amplifiers. Okay. I want you to see if you can write down just 6 amplifiers. And I want you to try to include at least 3 that are non-physical amplifiers. Okay. An amplifier would be like something you did, a movement, an activity, a position. A physical amplifier is something like that, right? A movement, position, activity, exercise is something that you did, something that you moved or did, right? But I want to see if you can identify some of your non-physical amplifiers like stress or lack of sleep or screen time or negative self-talk or people pleasing. Okay? Can you do that? Okay, now this was fun, hopefully, but now that you know how to manage pain and prevent pain flares, manage flares and prevent pain flares, for part 3, we're going to talk about how to lower the overall sensitivity level of your pain system. And so thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you found this helpful, and I cannot wait to see you back here. Bye, guys.